Hi, Pastor Mark Driscoll here from Mars Hill Church and the Resurgence with my friend, Dr. Don Carson. Should I call you D.A., Don, Dr. Carson? I know Mark Dever calls you the Don. I'm not sure exactly what's appropriate.
Do you have any idea where that came from?
I don't know that one. No, I don't.
It came from Australia, where nobody accords anybody any respect. It's a matter of principle.
It was a penal colony.
Yes,
so,
of course.
Yeah,
this is the background. But after I'd given a long series of talks about 15 years ago, the chap who was running that thing had a fantastic sense of humor. We were going back and forth at each other all the time. And he wound up with this long speech about how he was coming here and he was wondering what final thing he should say that would be appropriate and so on. And he says, suddenly there flashed before my eyes a veritable revelation. And he said, the dawn is good. Or is Don, is good, because apparently there's a big sausage company there who had on their trucks, is Don, is good. It was a sausage company called Don. So for a long time then, is Don, is good, was what everybody greeted me with when I went to Australia. It's the only country in the world where they could commend you by comparing you to a sausage.
Well, at least it wasn't a vegetable.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
So what I'd like to do, a little bit of time together, I've appreciated your writing for a lot of years. I started reading your stuff when I was a brand new Christian. And I know there's a lot of pastors and leaders who've been really influenced by your writing and your preaching and your teaching. And I know a recent project you published is more your backstory and your history and how it starts with your dad. I think some people are very familiar with you theologically, and I think that's very interesting to understand kind of God's work in your life. So if you'd be willing, maybe take a bit of time, tell us your history, your story, maybe start with your dad, because I think that's a very insightful piece.
The book you're referring to is called Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. And it came out of a realization that sometimes you go to these big conferences, and you're a John Piper or Tim Keller or whatever, and inevitably you're blessed by them, your horizons are expanded, it's a wonderful thing. Yet at the same time, there are an awful lot of ordinary pastors, like about 99% of us, who come away feeling a bit threatened, or I can never do that, and there can actually be some discouragement. Whereas my father was a quintessential ordinary pastor. He was born in Ireland, but grew up in Canada, and developed, in the mercy of God, a real concern for French Canada, where there were very few evangelical churches, just a smattering in a population of about 6.5 million. And he worked through all of the tough years, from the end of the 30s until he died 16 years ago. And during those tough years, for one period of time, for example, ministers were regularly beaten up and thrown in jail. Between 50 and 52, when I was just a little gaffer, Baptist ministers alone spent a total of 8 years in jail. And even when there was not that sort of thing, that only lasted a short while, but it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It was very, very difficult, challenging work. And he faced some struggles in the denomination and in his own doubts for himself and so on. But one of the things that was wonderful was his perseverance, and he kept journals for a lot of that time, so we could see his prayer life and his care for all kinds of people. And he nursed my mother through the Alzheimer's years. And
how long did she have Alzheimer's?
She was mugged at the age of 72, and symptoms started showing up right away, and 9 years later she died. So 9 years, in effect.
Wow.
And after she died, he started preaching again.
Did he preach?
By this time he was 78.
Did your dad preach your mom's funeral?
No. But on the other hand, in one sense, the funeral was a release. With Alzheimer's, you've already said all of your goodbyes, months and months, years before sometimes. By the time she had gone, by the time she died, she didn't recognize anybody. 3 months earlier, 4 months earlier, you could hold her hand, and her eyes were vacant, and then you'd sing, "Blessed Assurance," some old hymn or something, or quote something from the King James Version, and she'd get a little squeeze back, By the end, there was nothing, just nothing. So you've said your goodbyes, and by the time you actually get to the funeral, it's not as shattering as when somebody goes very quickly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then he started preaching and teaching, and in his journals, for example, he recorded. He was about 80 at the time. Words to this effect: "Save me from the sins of old men." A tendency to look backward and idealize the past. The temptation to resent younger men coming along who are more successful than I was. Too quick to turn on the television because I'm lonely. insufficient intercessory prayer for my grandchildren. He just goes down and lists this long thing, and then he says, save me from the sins of old men. And you realize there's a candor to him that was, it wasn't fake. What you saw was what you got. And I've long thought, as I've looked at my parents, that the worst kind of Christian home in which to grow up is the one where there are large spiritual pretensions but low spiritual performance. The best kind of Christian home to grow up in is the one where there are low spiritual pretensions but quite high spiritual performance. Because the best stuff is caught, not just taught.
Yeah, and with your dad, I mean, he loved your mom for 9 years with Alzheimer's,
Yep.
and he was not young, so
Yep,
that
sure.
was a great deal of work. How long did he pastor the church, and how big was it? I mean,
Well, most of the, I mean, he started off in an English language church while he was learning French in Montreal. Then he switched to the French side and started something from nothing. And it was only a few families. When then he moved into Drummondville to start a church there, and he was there for 16 years. And it was bilingual, so there was both an English congregation and a French congregation. And Sunday morning on a good Sunday, you probably get 40 to 45 on the English side, 35 on the French side, on a good Sunday. And a lot of Sundays weren't good.
Mm-hmm.
And when he moved up to Hull, he worked with another man there. And for most of the tough years, a congregation of 50 was substantial. And then after 1972, we saw something close to revival. In French Canada as a whole, there were about 35, 36 evangelical churches, and we grew in 8 years from 35, 36 churches to just under 500.
wow.
And some of them were several hundred people, which by our standards was enormous. And by that time, Dad was already in his 60s, and the leadership was falling on younger men and so on. But he became, at that point, one of the, it's hard to know what to call them, the venerable old men of Quebec. I mean, there were so many of these young guys coming along that were very keen but had no background, no knowledge, no real grasp. He was still having his devotions in Greek, and knowledge of Scripture that was pretty profound, and years of pastoral experience. He ran for years what he called la pastorale, which means something like the pastoral group, where he brought in a whole group of young pastors from the Outaouais region, the Ottawa Valley, and they all would come to his place early on Monday morning, stay for about 5 hours, and they'd pray for their people, work through theological questions, pastoral questions, and so on. He did that for years. And all that group of men, you talk to them today, they will tell you that they were shaped by Tom Carson. So that was part of the heritage that I grew up in.
In the hard and rough years for your dad, was he able to be working in ministry full-time, or did he have to be bivocational?
He was full-time until about the age of 50, or I've forgotten the exact year now. And then, because of some complex circumstances, he was bivocational. He worked as a federal government translator until the mandatory retirement age. And then, although he was retired and had some pension from the government, in fact, he worked virtually full-time in the local French church and in doing translating for the French work in Quebec.
In that time, did he get other offers to go elsewhere,
Yes.
bigger churches, more money?
He got a lot of offers to go into English Canada. Because of some things that had happened in the denomination in the late 40s, early 50s, he was actually a well-known man. He had taken some very painful steps on a matter of principle, and without rancor, he had held his head high. But as a result of that, there were many, many leaders in the churches in English Canada that held him in high regard. And several of them came knocking on his door and asking him to come and so on. But his heart was in French Canada. That's the way it was going to be. And so he wouldn't have considered a move.
Did he ever explain to you, son, this is why we're not moving, this is why we're not leaving?
Oh, and I was about 14, 15, something like that. Some things that happened that started in Africa. What was then the Belgian Congo erupted in civil war into what became the Congo, then Zaire, and so forth, as it was throwing off the yoke of colonialism. And during that strife, a lot of the missionaries, including American missionaries, left and went back home. And they started looking around for another part of the world that had French. And so some of them, inevitably, in America, then looked north across the border to French Canada. And so some of them came up into French Canada. And At the time, I was first or second year of high school. I was pretty young. But you see these people coming in, and inevitably there was sort of new encouragement. This will be wonderful, all of these people with lots of experience. Not one of them lasted more than 6 months. And with all the self-righteousness that only a 13 or 14-year-old can muster, I said to Dad, what's the matter with these people? Don't they have any grit, any stamina, any backbone? Why are they all wimping out just because it's a little tough? And he said, he was the mildest of men. He said, Don, you've got to understand, where they've been, where they have served, they have seen the grace of God in abundance. They have planted churches, whole denominations, started Bible schools, run hospitals. They've just seen lots and lots and lots of fruit. They come here and see how tough it is, and they take it as a sign that this can't be where God wants them, because being where God wants you means, in their minds, that there's lots of fruit. So I said to him with only the stupidity of a 13-year-old, well, then why don't you go someplace where you can make more of your life? And he wheeled on me, and he said, I stay because I believe God has many people in this place, and walked out of the room. Which, of course, is exactly the words that were given to Paul in Corinth when he was discouraged. You know, he was using election as a ground for hope and perseverance and stamina. That's right.
How do you think you'd be different if you wouldn't have had that father?
Oh, who's to know? Because what other father there would be? I mean, you know, and all three of us kids responded somewhat differently to those
arguments. Ask it a different way. What positive benefits came to your character from being shaped and formed in that environment? What things do you thank God for saying?
Oh, yeah. Well, one is the one that I've already mentioned. That is, my parents, whatever else they were or were not, I don't want to idealize them and make them out to super saints or something like that.
No, we're Calvinists. They're totally depraved.
Yeah, that's right.
But you can still love them.
But there was no phoniness to them. Kids have a very powerful phoniness snifter.
Yeah, especially previous generations of evangelical Christianity. Authenticity wasn't a huge value on behalf of the minister and his wife.
That's right. Let me tell you another story. I mentioned that my dad had gone through a really nasty crisis, concerned with a man, we'll call him Joe, but in fact he was an astonishingly well-known preacher in Canada, an extremely gifted man, and he had ended up doing some amazingly corrupt things, and my father was the butt of all of that. Now, when I grew up, I only heard good things about Joe, just wonderful stories, so on. Then eventually, years later, I'd done chemistry and math. I was going away from anything to do with pastoral theology. I wasn't heading in that direction. Then the Lord called me into the ministry, and I went to seminary. And in a course on Baptist history, I heard all about Joe and all of these developments and so on. And after the whole story was told, I found out that my father was one of these central figures in the whole flaming mess. And the last thing the teacher said was, one of the first things I want to see when I get to heaven is Tom Carson's crown. So the next time I got home, some weeks later, I said, I've been learning some things about 47, 48, 49. And Dad said, oh, yes. Are they true? Well, what did you learn? So I retold the story as I had heard it. And at that point, I hadn't read any of the documents. Now that my father's papers have come to him, I've read them all. But at that point, I had none of the documents. I just recounted the story as it was told to me in class. And I said, is that what happened? And he said, yeah, pretty close. I said, how come you've never told me? You never told my sister? You never told my brother? You never told us any of this stuff. Well, he said, there were two reasons. The first is, you're a son of the manse. So, although you see the gospel in the home and all of that, you see an awful lot of dirt. It's the way it is. And part of our job is to protect you from seeing too much dirt too young. You just didn't need to see that. You needed to be older. And, he said, after it happened, Marg, that is my mother, his wife, Marg and I, we realized that we had to guard our own hearts. We knew we couldn't succumb to bitterness. So we made a vow that we would never, ever say a negative thing about Joe, and we've kept our vow. Well, you come from that kind of background, and if I shoot off my mouth somewhere against someone or something, I remember that story. I mean, I wish I could claim I always had the same high standards. And then perseverance, a willingness to recognize that success is not always measured by bigness. It can be measured by faithfulness and integrity. How a man treats his wife when she's got Alzheimer's. There's a very important book on Alzheimer's called The 36-Hour Day, written by a couple of doctors, that describes the various stages of Alzheimer's. Very helpful to us, that predicted what kind of behavior would be there and how to respond to it and so on. And there are predictable stages where they go through really angry patches and so on. But I think that sometimes the anger is the result of not knowing how to handle them, not knowing when to push back and when to just let them go with it. My mother never went through those degrees of anger, partly because my father was so incredibly gentle with her. I never heard him say anything like, "This isn't the woman I married," or anything like that. It was always, "She gave so much to make my ministry fruitful for 40 or 50 years, and the least I can do is pay some small part of it back." They're just, what do you do with that? So undoubtedly, whether I realize it or not, that helped shape me when my wife was so sick with cancer and I canceled everything. And that will in turn shape my kids and how they will someday handle their spouses. I mean, a lot of these things are passed on by modeling.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to deny the importance of words, but in the family, the words have to be anchored in actions, or else they're not only empty, they may actually be counterproductive.
I know, can I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
That probably don't want to answer, but what's your degree? Your education? What are your degrees?
I did a science degree in chemistry and minor in mathematics at McGill University. And I worked for a while in air pollution in Canada. I did a Master of Divinity at Central Baptist Seminary in Toronto. And then I did a course or two out in Regent College while I was pastoring a church in Vancouver. And then I went to Cambridge and did a PhD there and did some study in Europe while I was there. That's it.
And you've written, published, edited more than 50 books. Yeah. How many countries have you preached in?
I don't know. I stopped counting them.
You travel more than anybody I know. How many times alone? I know we were together in Sydney, Australia. That was my first time. How many times have you been just to Sydney?
Well, to Australia, just above 60, somewhere between 65 and 70. I don't know how many.
70 trips to Australia. Yeah. People are very familiar, I think, with what you believe. You've written a lot. You've taught a lot. Your credentials are obviously good. I read somewhere you're fluent in 6 languages.
Oh, no. The stories get,
Well, this was in The Case for Faith or The Case for Christ.
Yeah, but these journalists, you don't want to trust Lee, do you?
I've never met him.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
Yeah.
Now, there's fluent and there's fluent and there's fluent.
Well,
I mean, to say that I can read a bunch of languages, I can read at some level or another about a dozen.
About a dozen
to
languages.
Read slowly with a dictionary.
None of them are Pig Latin?
No.
Legit languages.
Yeah, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean I could preach in them. The only languages where I could take an English manuscript and preach in either English or another language is French. Now, my pronunciation is good enough in German and Spanish, maybe one or two others, that if I had the whole thing written out, I could get away with it. I could pull it off. But that doesn't mean I really know the languages,
Most people don't know English. I mean, we text message,
Yeah.
So within that, those are your credentials. And let me ask you one more. Somebody told me, there's sort of weird, stuff gets said. Do you have the New Testament memorized in Greek?
No.
How much of it do you have
I don't know.
memorized in Greek?
A fair bit, but I've never done that sort of calculation. I don't have one of these remarkable photographic memories. I mean, I've known a few people who have. Mm-hmm. I knew a guy called Lachlan Shackleton Fergus. I mean, it's an unbelievable story.
Let's make him famous. Tell me the
story.
story.
Yeah. He was a PhD in law at Cambridge when I was there. And he got to be a good friend. He had a tough background in many ways, lost his fiancée in a traffic accident and so on. And he had this remarkable, perfect pitch, memory of everything.
But that's a bummer if his life is torrid.
Yeah, well, this was of text, and
Yeah.
it only lasted.
Okay.
It only lasted for about 6 weeks, and then it got more feeble. And so what he would do when he had to do another section of his dissertation, another thesis, meanwhile he was running off to Geneva with a foreign office holding this job and speaking there. He was having a blast. And then he had to get another chapter done. What he would do is he'd borrow books from the library on his topic. And he'd read 20 hours a day because he wanted to get it all done within the 6 weeks. He'd just read and read and read and read. And he'd remember it all. Just read and read. He became irritable. We'd bring food to him. We helped him out. 20 hours a day. Read, read, read. And then he would type at this tells you how long ago it was, an electric typewriter, an IBM ball on it and so on.
Wow.
And then
I've heard about those.
Yeah, and his mother came in from Gozo, where they had their summer estate in the Mediterranean, and would do the footnotes in the other one. And he would dictate to his mother the text over here. And he would be typing the footnotes over here without looking at anything. That would take 2 or 3 days to write up that chapter. Then he'd crash, go to sleep. His mother would fly back to Gozo. And then he would check out what he'd done. And he found on average 3 mistakes per 400 references. I saw, that's not hearsay. I saw that with my own eyes. It was unbelievable. I don't have any of those kinds of gifts. None.
Let me bring these two worlds together. Kind of the upbringing with, imperfect but godly, exemplary parents, small church, tough soil, heart for evangelism, and then you've got an academic side, good training, good mind. Bring those together. Lots of people know what you believe. Here's one thing I would like to do in this interview, and that is to introduce maybe some young guys to you that are not aware of you because they don't read books with footnotes. My hope is to encourage them to read your books and the footnotes. But you've also gotten in a few theological skirmishes and firefights over the years.
Mm-hmm, I have.
What would you say are the big battles you've sort of inserted yourself, written on, spoken on, taken a position on over the years?
Yeah, because I have tried pretty hard to be, not to make my whole ministry skirmishing.
Yeah, you've done a good job of not defining yourself by what you're against
all the time.
By what you're for.
Correct.
And making some clarifications as needed.
And because of that, I don't think I have faced the kind of antagonism that some guys have faced whose entire ministry is defined in terms of what they're correcting all the time. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, God's sovereignty and human responsibility has shown up in some of my books here and there, and that's got me in skirmishes with a variety of people. The openness of God theology got me into several severe skirmishes. Versions and translations and theory that goes behind it's got me into some skirmishes. Women's issues of one sort or another have got me into some skirmishes. Sometimes just the very nature of the gospel itself and how you go about defending it and articulating it, its comprehensiveness, and but that one is so close to what I'm doing all the time that I don't know if it's skirmish or not,
Yeah.
But what happens in some circles? There's some circles, academic or otherwise, where the skirmishing is part of the, I don't know if it's fun, but it's part of the game. It's part of the way you play it.
Yeah.
But with some debates, I don't even know if debates is the right word. In interactions with many in the emerging camp, my increasing perception is that many of the people in the emerging camp, now I know there are different branches of the emerging camp, but many of them don't read anything by anybody outside the people in the emerging camp.
Yeah.
So they all know pretty certainly that they hate me. But not many of them have actually read what I've written.
Yeah, this is where I was going. As well with justification and N.T. Wright.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on that one.
And the emerging church issue. The perception, I think, with some younger pastors and leaders who, who've only caught bits and pieces of internet blundering, I would say, is that you're an academician, not a pastor. You're a theoretician, not a practitioner. That you're an educator, not an evangelist. And that you don't do relationship and community, that you're sort of a cold, distant person who does better with books than human beings. And the reason I started the whole interview with some of your background and history and story is I know you, and I know that much of what is caricatured of you is just completely fallacious. It's just wrong. For some of those skirmishes you do get into, I guess it's important for me to ask, why? What's the motivation behind it?
Well, it's depended which one. In the case of the justification stuff, it was just getting more and more and more serious. A lot of popular stuff had been written, but then 2 or 3 of us put together the 2 big books, Justification and Variegated Nomism, which are scholarly tomes that most people shouldn't read.
Yeah, I've got them. They're big.
But on the other hand, the aim was to try to build a foundation that would help anchor some things that others could read and not be too threatened by some of the voices from the other side. And in God's providence, a lot of other books came out at about the same time. And academically, the corner's been turned on that one, although a lot of seminaries haven't figured that out yet. Whereas something like the Emerging Church, I wasn't planning on saying or doing anything on that one. But I was getting more and more phone calls from pastors saying, what do I do about this? Or my youth guy is now saying this, and what do I do about this? And there was nothing out there at the time. There was just about nothing out there from a respectful side that nevertheless tried to analyze things biblically or theologically. There just wasn't anything there. And I was supposed to give the Staley lectures at a Christian institution on a completely different topic. And they wrote me 3 months before I went and said, would you mind doing it on the Emerging Church? Oh, okay. So I tried to do some homework and gave 3 lectures. Well, it set off such a firestorm in the place that within 48 hours, one of the guys there had written something 3 times as long as my lectures trying to refute me. And I thought, okay, I guess I better write a book. So I wrote the book, Becoming Conversant with the Emerging Church. And that was a firestorm. You wouldn't believe some of the hate mail I got from that one.
For people that are loving, tolerant, diverse.
Oh, yes.
They do community and conversation. That's
unbelievable.
Dialogue, not monologue, and they were just talking to you in a negative way?
Whereas I tried very hard in the book, and I put it through 2 or 3 editors, to make sure that there was absolutely nothing in the book that was malicious or condescending, or it tried to make strong theological points. But I try to avoid ad hominem arguments. What can I say? I don't know. If I were to leave Trinity for any reason to go somewhere else, it would almost certainly not be to go back to a university post. I've had those offered to me, or to another seminary. Why do I want to go from one seminary to another? It would be to go back to pastoral ministry. And the highlight in my week at the seminary is my small group. We have students in our home all the time. And
how many evangelistic messages do you preach in a year? I know you do a lot of evangelism. I think that's a part of your ministry that a lot of people are just unaware of.
Yeah, I'm probably doing a few, several fewer now than I used to. But I used to aim to do a couple of university missions a year. And for one reason or another, that's been reduced. If I get one in every 18 months, I'm grateful. And then some churches you go to, because they're that kind of church, you make sure that there's a huge evangelistic emphasis. Well, that's what's going to happen here, God willing, tomorrow morning. Yeah. Because it's the kind of church it is, you're going to have a lot of unbelievers present, so you have to bear them in mind. Yeah. And I believe strongly that all of us are supposed to be doing evangelism. I don't claim to be a great evangelist. To be honest, you know what I am? I'm a jack of all trades. I'm not really good at anything, but I can do a lot of stuff. That's what the Lord has made me.
Well, how about this one? And then I'll end with my final question. Those who would criticize you and say, well, he doesn't understand because we're doing missiology and he doesn't understand, cultural contextualization. I mean, I know you well enough. I hear that all the time. It's like, you got to be kidding me.
I've probably lived and worked in more cultures than most of these people who are criticizing me. What can I say?
Yeah, how many... you have no idea how many nations you've been in.
No. Scores.
I mean, dozens and dozens. Mm-hmm. Preached, taught, served pastors, ministered, travel. Yeah, the cross-cultural piece, you've seen more of the world than anybody personally I've ever met, to be honest with you. And
sometimes, some of that stuff has come out in my book, Christ and Culture Revisited, trying to think things through. They are tricky bits. They're very tricky bits. And I'm not trying to justify them. One of the reasons why I don't usually defend myself from those things is the Lord's going to sort it all out at the end, and God knows I've made my mistakes in judgment on this or that. I really don't want to spend any time justifying everything I've said or done, or I just don't want to do that. No, but on the other hand, I'm probably not quite as isolated as some people think.
Yeah, and I think that's the part of getting to know you a bit through the Gospel Coalition that I've appreciated. I know you love the church. I know you love people. I know you love evangelism, and I know you love all the nations of the earth. And I know that your heart for what you do is motivated by those loves. So maybe I'll throw you one more question in the end. Proceeding forward for young pastors, ministry leaders that would hear this lecture, this discussion or some of the lectures in conjunction with it, areas they should be studying, points of theological concern, things that they need to be prepared for that you see will be issues in the coming years.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is, it's going to be so obvious. It's
You say something about the gospel?
Something about the gospel in the Bible. I mean, read the Bible. And not read it casually or only devotionally, whatever that means. Read it reverently. Aim not so much to be a master of it as to be mastered by it, but learn how it fits together. Learn how to preach the whole counsel of God. It means learning some biblical theology. Read commentaries. Read expositions by gifted people from the past. Read devotional expositions of it. Read technical expositions of it to the level of your own capacity. First of all, you've got to understand the Bible, because an awful lot of a younger generation of pastors, in my judgment, thinks they know the Bible and the gospel the gospel and the Bible pretty well, and what they've really got to focus on is the culture, and then they'll know how to communicate it. Well, you certainly do have to understand the culture. I keep insisting on that as strongly as I can in as many circles as I can all the time. But I do think the balance with some of the new generation is flipped so much on that side that they don't have nearly enough content under their belt to communicate to the broader generation. And so they're more snookered by the surrounding culture than they think they are. And so the first things first, you still have to learn to pray. You still have to learn to read the Bible. You still have to learn to teach the Bible, the whole counsel of God. And you have to learn to do it in a particular cultural setting. But first things first, that's the very first thing I would say. Then after that, I'm happy to talk about trends and temptations and fields of intellectual discourse that are coming up that we have to wrestle with. And I do think we're heading into another round on the authority of Scripture.
The inerrancy debate, even among some solid evangelicals, will be back for debate.
Oh, yeah. And there are lots and lots of people who call themselves evangelical because that's the tribe they belong to sociologically. But deep down, they're embarrassed to be evangelicals. Deep down, they may even be embarrassed by the evangel. And one has to make a distinction between evangelicalism as a sociological label. It includes everything from snake handlers to who knows what, and I don't want to be associated with all of that. And evangelicalism that is committed to the evangel, and that I don't want to step away from. If you step away from that, you're stepping away from the gospel. You're stepping away from what is central in Scripture. You're stepping away from the lordship of Christ. And so I worry about evangelical institutions where significant numbers of their faculty or significant numbers of pastors seem to me sometimes to be more interested in winning the plaudits and the acclaim of being large-hearted and big-spirited than they are with being faithful to the gospel. I think that's to the evangel, and in that sense to evangelicalism. That, I think, is a huge danger. There's a danger of being, well, Paul says that he is willing to become all things to all men so that by all means he might win some. There is a danger of trying to be so cross-cultural, multicultural, intercultural, whatever, that you become nothing to nobody so that by no means can you win anybody. Yeah. You're always above the fray. You never belong anywhere. And that might be a certain kind of enlightenment goal of scholarly neutrality and so on, but it's not a biblical thing. You belong to Christ. And he made you, he bought you, and you answer to him. And that kind of neutrality is not a godly sign. It's a form of idolatry. So I think we're running into those kinds of things now. It comes back, that one, but it's recurring on several doctrinal areas in my judgment. But I also think that some things on justification we're still working through. In another field, some things on the openness of God theology we're still working through. There are all kinds of moral, sociological things. Tim Keller says that the toughest thing he faces amongst the young men in his church, the toughest thing he has to deal with in terms of the reformation of their lives, is getting them to think differently about women and marriage. Mm-hmm. This is a generation of young men who are, by and large, pretty narcissistic and
porn addicted,
slow to make decisions, slow to commit themselves. All that kind of thing. Yeah. And so we've had long conversations about that's not going to go away real soon either. So one can point out to all these things that are going on around us, and you know them as well as I do. They're interesting, they're challenging, but if it weren't that, it were something else. It would be something else. You know, I go to different parts of the world, and it's something different. Pastor friends of mine in Soweto who are facing 7 or 8 funerals every Saturday. Boy, I bet you don't do that.
No, I've not done 7 or 8 funerals in 12 years of pastoral ministry.
That's exactly what I mean. But you see, they're right in the midst of the slum and the HIV and the AIDS and the deaths and so on. There are different challenges in different parts of the world, aren't there? And at the same time as I go to other countries and other places, and I try to understand what's going on and learn from it, what I do discover is that the most important thing to do and say in all of those countries and all of those places is to stick to the central things, to the gospel, to who Christ is, to what he's done, to preparing for eternity, to the communion of the saints, to worshiping God, understanding what the cross and resurrection are all about, who the Holy Spirit is. I mean, all those things are central no matter where you are, whether you're in Pungo or Taiwan or Seattle, you know? So the first things have to be the first things. And then after that, how they get teased out in application in particular ways, in particular subcultures, that takes some sensitivity. But still, the first things are the first things.
Cool. We'll leave it at that. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.